A massive shout out to the Jonan tier member Mr. Leroy 1998 and Jenan tier Leah Rov. Your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, support the channel, as well as receive special perks and access exclusive series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. Hi guys, this is the first part of What If Wendy Didn't Get Frozen in Time? Written by LastStationLover 5000, suggested by M. Lee Fist and brought to you by Ray What If. I hope you enjoy. For a more noble finale, interrupting his line of thought came a sudden explosion of fire cracking against the side of Acnologia's head. It didn't so much as budge him, but the dragon did cease its swelling magic it was preparing to use on the massive old man. Craning its neck up, it'd see a bandaged figure ebbing flames. And he wasn't alone. Gramps, Natsu crowed out with a raised, infernal fist. We can't leave without you. No, you fools, Makarov croaked out with panicked eyes. I am not worth it. Leave now while you still. Master, Urza Scarlet cried out, raising a sword towards him. I seem to recall every mage of fairy tale has value. Or did you forget what we did to Phantom Lord for Lucy? We aren't leaving you behind, old man, Laxus proclaimed, his body igniting into a fierce mantle of lightning. Don't like it? Then I guess we're all banished from the guild. And that means we don't have to listen to stupid orders like leaving you behind. Everyone, Makarov stammered as his eyes began to water. Acnologia released a damning howl towards the returning quarry it had set out to kill. Despite the earlier terrifying scream, a just as mighty cacophony of cries was returned. Dozens of mages leapt into the fray on their master's behalf, releasing hundreds of magical explosions of all kinds across its scaled body. The devil swung its arms around, swatting at his foes like hands to gnats. While some were thrown back by the force of its clawed limbs, others more tenacious appeared. Gildarts landed a punch to one arm with his prosthetic, leading to Laxus flying headbutt into its exposed jaw to make it meet up. Following that, the two most powerful men of fairy tale drew back their legs and sent a shattering blast of white and yellow energy to send it scraping over the sea away from the island. Vernier, Wendy chanted, using what magic she had to boost Laxus, Gajiel, Natsu and herself. Vernier. After the second enchantment was used, the four slayers swiftly took to the edge of the beach. While the beast snarled at the continuous bombardment of elements, weapons and other miscellaneous spells, its blank eyes fixated on the enhanced four slayers. Through its pupilless gaze it reflected the colors of their aura, their chests swelling with energy. And then, a massive torrent of power cutting a swath through the ocean towards it. Combined, it detonated with the force of a bomb that would have leveled the island. A tumultuous rolling sphere of burning, electrified, razor-filled wind pushed back the body of water and dented it to the shallower part of the seaside floor. The light caused many onlooking and fighting mages to cover their eyes, wincing at it. The shockwave that came after even brought some of them off their feet, while others barely standing still despite it all. But, a whooshing blur of black threw back the glare of light and water even further. Outstretched arms and curled talons revealed a gaping mouth that let loose a voice something akin to a gurgle and a howl. It became evident what it was when Gildarts jeered ahead with a knowing look. He's laughing at us, he spoke lowly. Just like I thought, this didn't even faze him. Damn it, Natsu swore aloud, heaving heavily from the exertion along with the other mages standing defiantly on their feet. I put all I had into it. And he didn't even budge. What's the point of us being slayers if we can't even dent one lousy dragon? Gajiel growled out with balled fists at his side, indicating his indignation. Before Wendy's horrified gaze, she saw the black-winged apocalypse lunge straight towards the sky. High above the island, where none could reach, they'd see a second sun glaring down at them, which they soon realized was just the shine of their imminent enemy's magic about to be released. As a feeling of dread was about to commence, Lucy held out a hand for Natsu to hold despite the current predicament. With water in her eyes, and a sad smile, she spoke with nothing but love for her friend. Let's go home, Natsu. Smiling back, somberly, the salamander took her hand into his and nodded with a simple, yeah. Endeared through this act of mutual kinship, Urza took hold of Natsu's other hand. Linked in soon by Gray, Juvia and then Levi with Gajiel, a circle of united love for each other replaced the dread that was festering within them. It ended with Wendy, grabbing Charlie's paw and reaching around to another's when her eyes looked up. And she faltered in reaching for the last hand. What she saw was no longer a swirling ball of light but a curling pair of wings within an inferno. The center of it she could make out as a ghastly wave of death, all screaming out to her inevitable demise. Grimly staring down at her, the young slayer shook in place and couldn't hear her exceed trying to shake her out of her own self-imposed paralysis of shock. But by then it was already happening. A pillar of silver roared below from Acnologia's gaping mouth. Streaming down into the center of the aisle, an overwhelming dome of erasing energy bore fruit from its epicenter. Doubling and even tripling the size of the four-slayer combined breath spell, any hint of the best of fairy tale existing was soon dispelled. The island and its inhabitants were gone, with only the rolling tides acknowledging the space that was once present. Howling, the devil split the heavens with the might of its voice. Distant spectators of the Magic Council would see its behemoth silhouette soon lurch and then spirit away into the horizon, leaving the once sacred birth of fairy tale in complete oblivion. The force of the explosion from Acnologia knocked Wendy Marvell out cold. Her body was lifeless, floating in the churning currents of ocean, still being rocked by the strength of Acnologia's breath attack. Clinging to the girl for dear life was the diminutive form of Charles, who had been protected by Wendy's small body. The tiny Exceed struggled to keep herself and her friend afloat. From every direction, she could see only water, massive waves rising high, blocking her sight of the horizon. Charles was beginning to feel terrified. They'd escaped Acnologia only to be fighting against the immense power of the ocean. The massive waves pushed Wendy's unconscious body and Charles to and fro, the Exceed helpless against the force of the ocean. Acnologia's strength was something to be feared. His breath attack, and its resulting destruction, had created an effect on the nearby waters that could only be compared to a severe storm. Sweeping upwards, the waves crashed down, dragging Charles and Wendy underneath the frigid blackness. Charles struggled upward, forcing herself to fight against her own body and drag Wendy back to the surface. Bobbing her head upwards, she gasped for air, searching desperately for anything to use as support. Nothing. She began to panic again. How do I get out of this? Thought Charles desperately. I can't let Wendy die out here. If there's no one here to protect her, then I will. Her small eyes, fighting the sting of the salt water, continued their desperate search. Once again, she came up empty. The surge lifted Charles and Wendy up high, before dropping them again, merely reaffirming the power of the ocean and their own powerlessness. After what seemed like hours of seeing nothing and getting nowhere, Charles pulled together her magical power. From her back, she sprouted feathery, angelic wings, a magic common to all Exceed. Water churned around Charles, separate from the swirling waves and crashing surges. With immense effort, the small cat-like creature pulled Wendy out of the ocean, rushing high into the sky at the fastest speed she could manage. Free from the waves, Charles took only a moment to take in the sky, before searching the horizon. There was nothing but endless sea. Merely taking to the heavens had improved their situation only marginally. Wendy, I will protect you, so just hold on. Charles focused entirely on the air magic she was generating. Max speed. With as much effort as Charles could, she tore across the ocean. White and blue became a blur for the small Exceed. She knew she was taking a risk. Expending all of her magic like this in the hopes of finding somewhere dry. It was almost impossible, but Fairy Tale banked on impossible odds, and she would not let Wendy die here. Had she been flying for minutes? Hours? Had it been a day? Charles didn't know, but she pushed on, even as her wings began to flicker and fade. In her eyes, something mixed in with the colors of blue and white. The faded hues of blue and green. Charles slowed to a stop, her wings vanishing at this exact unfortunate moment. She hurtled towards the ocean again, keeping a tight hold on Wendy, the stinging cold of the ocean familiar at this point. However, to their fortune, Acnologia's attack had not reached here, and the water was calm. See it, she spluttered between coughs of salt water. And so she did. It looked like a small island. Was it inhabited? She had no idea, but it was close enough to swim towards. The Exceed paddled there, desperately keeping Wendy's head above the water level as she swam. It took an excessive amount of effort, but with the ocean calm, Charles was able to pull herself and Wendy onto the shore of the island. Surveying the island, she saw that it was ridiculously small and uninhabited. Exhausted, the Exceed laid an ear towards Wendy's chest. She was breathing, but it was ragged and shallow. Worried, Charles placed her paws on the young girl's diaphragm and pushed. Forcefully and repetitively, she pushed, until Wendy's body gave a jerk, a cough, and water spurted from her mouth. Her breathing steadied itself, and Wendy slept. Charles breathed a sigh of relief, and collapsed by Wendy's side. We're alive. The next morning the sound of sniffling woke Charles. Rubbing her eyes with her paws, she looked around and saw Wendy, huddled a short distance away. She was hugging her legs, her body shaking. It was obvious she was crying. Charles got up, shaking sand out her fur and walking over Wendy. Tentatively, she reached towards the girl's knee. At contact, Wendy jerked away, raising her head to reveal reddened eyes where tears were flowing freely. See Charles, Wendy. Charles could only mutter her companion's name, not knowing what to say. It took her as a great surprise when Wendy pulled her into her arms, still sobbing hysterically. Charles was flabbergasted, muttering incomprehensible words. The Exceed was unable to get a proper word out of herself, or to get Wendy to say anything beyond unintelligible blubbering. It's all right, Wendy. Charles reached up to stroke Wendy's azure-colored hair. It's not. Wendy wailed. We left everyone died back there. She was shuddering violently, her sobs increasing. What have we done, Charles? Lucy, Natsu, Urza, everyone. I know. The tears began to well up in Charlie's eyes as well. She'd spent so much time the previous day trying to save Wendy that she hadn't had the time to properly address the fact that their comrades and their guild had gone up in a blinding flash of light. At this point, she would give anything even to hear an "Aye, sir," from Happy, just to hear that familiar voice that was always there. The two of them began to cry in unison, and their wails filled the silence of the otherwise tiny island. They cried without shame, and without stopping, mourning their lost comrades with all of their heart. Hiccuping, Wendy finally spoke. What do we do now? Where are we, Charles? I don't know, replied Charles, realizing for the first time that she truly had no idea where she'd taken them. I was so desperate to get you somewhere safe, that I just flew. She rubbed Wendy's eyes, wiping the tears away, and using her tail to accomplish the same for herself. But I'd think that everyone would want us to live. The shaking from their sobbing hadn't subsided, but the tears has finally ceased. Her voice was becoming stronger. We should get back to Fiore. And tell everyone what happened. We can't afford to just sit here. Wendy nodded slowly. Why, you're right. She knew this, but she desperately wanted to keep crying. She felt like it was her fault that everyone had died. She let go. When everyone stood their ground against that dragon, she had let go. Wendy wasn't there with everyone when Acnologia had dealt the finishing blow, and at the expense of everyone else's lives, she'd survived. We can't dishonor everyone's memories like this. The young dragon slayer forced herself to her feet, Charles still in her arms. All right, Charles. Her voice was still weak, and she looked shaky. We're going to head home. Unprompted, Wendy fell back towards the ground, dizziness overtaking her. Exhaustion and a lack of food and water had overtaken her. Quickly, Wendy's world went black. It towered over her. Standing before Wendy was a shadow-black mass, a gargantuan demon composed entirely of quivering blackness. Its eyes, a staggering pure white, gleamed, contrasting against the darkness that constituted the entirety of its form. The visage of this creature, constantly shifting, phasing, and never able to be clearly defined by her mind, terrified the young girl even more so than its size, and she found herself rooted to the spot. Then the entity roared, and the sound left the girl petrified more still. It was horrible, an unearthly shout from another world. Wendy's body trembled, her legs felt like jelly. When the beast turned its attention to her, Wendy's only action was to let out a barely stifled whimper, tears flooding her eyes. The shadow demon's clawed hand reached downward, snatching Wendy up from the ground, causing her eyes to widen with shock and surprise. Squirming, the girl looked to and fro for help, shivering in horrified fear. Wendy was lowered towards a gaping maw, a clear, vivid red amid the filtering shadows, steaming hot breath impacting Wendy's struggling form. She could smell the sweet, rotting stench of a carnivore. The tongue, dark purple, reached outwards, twisting and bending around her body as it drew her into the cavernous mouth. Unable to fight against the strength of the muscle holding pulling her firmly towards the creature's throat, Wendy accepted a terrifying fact. She was going to die. Gasping heavily, Wendy sat bolt upright in bed, her body sweating, feeling as if she'd just run a mile. Blinking rapidly, the girl glanced around. She was laying in a bed, tucked away in some strange room that she didn't recognize. But she was mercifully alive. Whatever that had been, it was nothing more than a nightmare. Wendy placed a hand to her chest, desperately reaffirming the fact that she was indeed still alive when she felt her heart pulsating madly. I'm alive. But where am I? Wendy's eyes scanned the area. It was a small room with stonework flooring and walls that had the feeling of being cleaned once every few days. It was dimly lit, but as her eyes adjusted, Wendy could see it was sparsely decorated. The room hardly felt lived in. Moving her hand around the bed, Wendy felt it was empty. Wherever she was, Charles was nowhere to be found, and this simply made Wendy even more uneasy. Charles, Wendy called out into the gloom. No response. Charles, where are you? Wendy's voice, stronger than it had been back on the island where she'd awoken before, was tinged with panic and desperation. Her call was greeted by unbroken silence. Wendy slid out of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold stones of the floor. This was, besides her voice, the only noise she'd heard since waking up, and it did little to comfort her. Standing at her full height, she was able to get a slightly better view of the room. She could see in closer relief the scattered pieces of furniture. To her left was the door that she assumed led out. It was sturdy, made of mahogany, or so it smelled to the young slayer. Wendy realized that she still found it difficult to stand. Her legs were rebelling against her, the young girl's muscles weak. She felt much older than she actually was, but now wasn't the time to dwell on that. Wendy hobbled to the door as quick as her weakened body would allow, and it opened with the ease of turning the handle. She walked out into an empty corridor, made of the same stone that her room had been constructed with, and realized that she was still very much alone. I have to find Charles. Wendy's thoughts were frantic. Everyone else is gone. Please don't leave me too, Charles. Wendy turned left, edging herself along the wall. She proceeded by touch, due to a lack of any real light, and her eyes adjusted to the further darkness. Several doors adorned the wall of the corridor, spaced sporadically from one another. An inactive part of Wendy's brain had to assume this was a residential floor. Charles. Wendy shouted again the name of her companion, the response once again being silent. Charles, are you here? Where are you? Continuing to navigate the hallway, Wendy could see a faint shine of light clinging to the side of the wall. The blue-haired girl's eyes fell upon an arched window. The sunlight was practically blinding after the darkness of the hallway. Giving her eyes time to recover, Wendy reached the window and looked into the outside world. A city spread out below her, initially appearing as a massive, scattered jumble of shapes she couldn't immediately discern. White buildings jutted out to the sky in between flecks of green, yet she could see hints of smaller, more homely dwellings closer to the window. Roads twisted and looped around the town like rivers of stone, and Wendy could see the bustling shapes of people. Wherever she was, at least it was civilization. This was a slight relief to Wendy, who turned away from the window. To come face to face with a child. The child was a head shorter than Wendy, with dark crimson hair, done up in a ponytail, staring at her with exuberant blue eyes. She was, if anything, brighter than the light pouring out of the window behind Wendy, dressed in a simple shirt dress of pinks and blues. She tilted her head quizzically, owlish eyes blinking in rapid succession. Wendy was taken aback by the strange child. Brown eyes stared into blue, and she tried to phrase the question without sounding impolite. Who are you? I'm Sharia, replied the girl brightly. Everyone is looking for you. Deserted Island Hope. It's what Doranbolt, code-named Mest, while infiltrating Fairy Tale on behalf of the Magic Council, felt upon finding a faint trace of Ethernano within the ocean. Where the massive aura that made up the infamous guild of Fiore's mages had once presided, they and their sacred island of Tenro had vanished in a single breath spell from the black-winged apocalypse. Once it had dispatched its quarry, Acnologia had left to the horizon, leaving no trace of its vector nor an idea where it was intending to be next. That was, after combing the sea for the following day, they had found something. It was essentially a trace of unusual magic that was discharged in the air, and dispersed into the tumultuous sea below. The agents for the council scoured for an exact feed, but couldn't find anything precise. With this lead, though, he had left Lahar behind to continue searching for anything else while he went in the estimated location the burst of magic was sent. Luckily for the teleporter, he had found something. It had taken him the better part of the following day, of course, but he saw signs of actual disturbance of the earth where something small and even smaller still had lied on the soil. The magic was fresh, barely a day old at best. A survivor, it must be, he thought, blinking as he shoveled through the ground, trying to see if something had perhaps been buried. Sure enough, After his sleeves were stained by blotches of brown, the crimson striped-topped man withdrew a long strand of bloodied wrapping. A bandage. A bandage, a small form the size of a toddler. In a smaller than average-sized human, this can only mean. A sudden crackling sound came from the satchel slung around his left shoulder. A muffled voice was calling for him, and he knew who it belonged. Reaching into the leather container, he withdrew a crystal sphere, a communications lacrima, and it showed an immediate transparent image of bespectacled, teal-white-robed man in charge of the Rune Knights himself, Lahar. Doranbolt, I have news, he intoned with a cagey expression on his face. During our search we have found not a sign that the rest of the Fairy Tale Guild has survived. Not a hint of magical energy of theirs, nor the abundant life force that made up the island, can be found. It is likely it was completely annihilated, down to the last atom. Please don't tell me things I already know, the scarred man grimaced, his hand clutching at the orb with barely restrained emotion he had repressed inside of himself. The guilt, the gnawing sensation that he had done nothing to save anyone. But now, he had a lead and a promise that not all was lost. I had already found signs that something resembling a survivor had assuredly made landfall off the coast of Fury. Tracking them from here will be difficult, but not impossible. That's the other thing, Lahar cut him off, holding a hand up to the sphere of his own that he had set up on a pedestal on the ship he was operating at. Apparently, a guild operating near your location known as Lamia Scale has reported taking in a member of Fairy Tale into their custody. They haven't been able to contact her peers, so they sent a notification to one of our nearby branches who notified us. Withdrawing a piece of paper, he began to read off the message in its entirety. Due to the absence of immediate comrades, we are nursing an unconscious mage of Fairy Tale back to health. We don't know the cause of injuries, but it is safe to say that there had likely been a violent altercation. Once she awakens, we will try to find out the truth, but until then, please let us know if you can find anything else out for us. With earnest haste, Guild Master Uba. Lamia Scale, Doranbolt whispered, his eyes already looking towards the mainland with a fixed stare in the distance. I know where to go next. Thanks, Lahar. Wait, don't you want me to tell you the description of the mage? I don't need it, he dismissed, deactivating the lacrima and placing it into his satchel. Please be who I think you are. And, in a flash, he disappeared, off to Lamia Scale to confirm his singular hope. Walked forward astride Jura, whose face was stern, spoke as well. It really has been a while, Wendy. Not since the incident with Oración Cease and Nirvana. I'm sorry we picked you up in such a sorry state, but I'm glad to see you're finally moving around. J. Jura, L. Leon. The relief that accompanied familiarity welled up in Wendy's heart, her eyes beginning to mist with tears again. Forcibly, she held them back this time, quickly wiping her eyes to put on a brave face. It's good to see you again. She did mean it, earnestly, but her current emotional turmoil kept this reunion from being truly happy. So this is Lamia Scale. She hadn't wanted to doubt little Sharia, but part of her had wondered if the child hadn't been 100% truthful. That part of her deeply regretted mistrusting the girl. Have you all seen Charles? Whatever the reason, to think that the tales of Acnologia were true. Even if it wasn't the Black Dragon in the Book of Apocalypse himself, a dragon attack on the island of Tenro cannot go unacknowledged, said Jura gravely. I will contact the master through Lacrima later. The council must be made aware of this. That is worrisome, muttered Leon, who had suddenly managed to ditch his overcoat and shirt, showing off a remarkable bare chest. To think that the bulk of Fairy Tale would be snuffed out so unexpectedly by a dragon. It's almost too unreal. We're glad you agree, Leon, nodded Toby, his face switching from calm to incredulous in an instant. But did you need to strip here, Leon? Regardless, Jura cleared his throat gruffly. Our primary goal now is Wendy's safe return to her guild. The handling of this Acnologia, and other matters, can be worried about once she is safely back among her own. In that case, I would ask that you leave the task to me. The voice that spoke next did not belong to a single person who was already in the room. It was a different voice, and Wendy Marvell recognized it immediately. It's you, Wendy choked out, her voice stuck on reflex to say the name she had thought was the man's name. Instead, the scarred, short-haired man with a striped high-collared shirt of red and yellow wasn't who everyone thought he was. He wasn't Mest, but someone the council sent to spy on the Guild of Fairy Tale. She remembered him being convinced, albeit temporarily, to help fight Grimoire Heart, but he eventually fled before. As tears renewed, the azure-haired girl found herself weeping again, though this time louder. The memories were still fresh, painful, and she couldn't help but fall to her knees as she let the moisture slide hotly down her face. I have teleportation magic, Doranbolt explained, waving a hand with emphasis. Since I've been to their guild hall before, I can make the trip in a single go. All I need is to have physical contact with Wendy and I'll bring her home. Impressive, Leon spoke, somehow now bereft of his pants as he leaned back with his arms clasped over his chest without batting an eye that he stripped, much to the visible chagrin of his colleagues. I can see why the council values your skills so highly to act on your own. Yes, well, thanks, I suppose, Doranbolt replied, awkwardly scratching his chin at being praised, regardless of how passive-aggressive it sounded. After Wendy recollected herself, she grabbed a hold of Charles in her arms and bid everyone in Lamia's scale farewell. She thanked Sharia for making her feel welcome and the rest for having her as their guest for so long. Promising to see them soon when she can, Doranbolt places a hand on her shoulder and nods stoically at the others, thanking them for what they've done for Wendy. And, in an instant, they vanished with no trace behind but the soil he left from his clothes on their floor. Toby, Leon commented, patting the dog-cat man on his shoulder. Time to clean that up. But it wasn't my fault. He lamented. Hey, is that? A voice from the mission board piped up. The mage who hadn't went on a job in years, Nab, was the muscular man adorned in Islander native garbs with a sleeveless jacket and shorts, allowing his bare feet to touch the floor while his brawny hands slackened to his sides. As he spoke, another girl, Kanana, a recent addition who was a waitress, dropped her platter in surprise. The clattering of dishes caused everyone who was either paying attention to the older men and woman's antics jerked immediately to the now petrified Wendy. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears as voices made gasps in the pregnant pause. Even though the master of Lamia's scale had already spoke of this development not but earlier in the day, it was still hard to imagine. Wendy, lackey, a lavender-haired girl with a red bow and spectacles, cried out. You really are alive. Hi. Wendy managed to shakily raise a hand, her face paling and her eyes spinning. Before she had much of a chance to say anything, a slew of people suddenly galloped to meet her. Wendy squeaked out, holding onto the unconscious Charles in fear as she was about to be assailed by a bunch of mages aiming to embrace and or meet her head-on. Doranbolt, thankfully, stepped in between her and the rest with hands raised up before the heel-skidding mages. Take it easy, he tried to speak diplomatically. She just got up and around after being bedridden. It's alright, Doranbolt, really, Wendy tried to speak up, causing the scarred man to look over with a puzzled expression. Despite her squeamish expression, she stomached it back and put on a weak smile. They're friends. You don't need to protect me. If you say so, he sighed, stepping aside and letting her shakily approach them. The first was Lackey, who leapt up and hugged Wendy. Despite squeaking out a slight meep, she hugged back. Soon Nab gave her a big hug as well, which was then shared by a duo hug by the gunslingers Alzak and Biska. Max Allure, the dark blonde with a bowl-cut hair and short blue t-shirt, gave her a half-hug and Ritas gave her a tearful embrace. Vegeta, Warren and Mickey all gave their praise, comments and sign of affection. Even young Romeo gave Wendy a hug, the Slayer having to bend over but was thankful for the thought of it. Even those she didn't recognize gave her hugs, shakes of the hand and headpats, all doing their best to make her feel welcome back into the guild. When it came to Macau, the older man gave her a firm rub on the head which Wakaba doubled. While Uba just scowled to nothing in particular, she waddled over to a table and sat on a chair, observing their conversation with interest but saying nothing. Wendy, we heard you were found outside of the Lamia scale. We didn't know what to make of it, the acting guild master spoke, his tall form standing with his arms crossed seriously over his chest. I know the worst has possibly come to pass, but I think we'd all like to know. What happened out there? Where's the master, Natsu and the others? Wendy knew she had to steel herself for the eventuality they'd bring this up. Even though she had just explained it to Lamia scale not but an hour ago, it was still a painful thing to bring up. Too exhausted to cry, she took a deep breath and held Charles tight as she began to retell the tale of how the exams started. She omitted the part where she found out Doranbolt was an agent for the Magic Council, and how he was sent there by a task force to undermine the guild in some way, but the rest, of how he helped, and the enemies they faced, achieving narrow victory against Grimoire Heart, only to then be set afoul by the nightmare that was Acnologia. Did you say, Acnologia? Wakaba inquired, his squinting eyes open wide with recognition. It was shared in accompaniment with Macau, and even Lamia Scales Guild Master's mouth hung ajar at hearing that last bit. To hear about our former master, Prect, attacking us is one thing. But the black-winged apocalypse. That's something I never would have thought could come across our people, Macau spoke, his face beading sweat while his eyes focused at the floor while cupping his chin in thought. I think that'd explain why when Gildarts returned he was all bandaged up from his failed mission. At first I thought something else could have done it, but now I know he had run into him to begin with. But to run into him again, with all of our comrades just recovering from a fierce fight. Damn bad luck, that is. Forgive us, Master, Lackey proffered, raising a hand for the man to look over at her with curiosity. But what is Acnologia? Wendy says he was a dragon, but most dragons we hear about in books don't have names. Why is his so special? We're not actually really sure, Macau confessed, lowering his left hand to his hip while gesturing with the other for emphasis. All we do know is that anytime he's shown up, death and destruction follow his wake. The largest achievement of his that got him written in the Book of Apocalypse was him annihilating an entire country overnight. Of all dragons that's come before, he was the worst and the one that all men fear, perhaps even the last living dragon that no magic on this world can harm it. How terrible, Kanana exclaimed, holding a hand up to her mouth, tearing up at the thought of the kind dwarf Makarov being gone so completely after he had taken her in. Natsu, Gray, Urza, Alzak grimaced, looking down with balled-up fists while Biska places a comforting hand on his shoulder, one he raises a hand to squeeze it back, his face giving her a bittersweet smile of thanks in return. Mira Jane, Elfman, even Gildarts and the Master, Warren grimaced, his rounded lips shaking as his eyes watered up. To think they're all just gone. Just like that. But how did Wendy survive that? Nab inquired, scratching his head as he looked over at the glum-expressed Slayer, still cradling the Exceed in her arms, still asleep from the exhaustion her healing magic had only just assisted in recovering from. If she survived, Jet began to say, looking over at Droy with a faint bit of hope glimmering in their eyes. Then, maybe Levi has too. If someone like Wendy could make it, anything's possible, right? And what do you mean by that? Doranbolt sharply asked, catching the pair of Shadow Gear dead in their tracks. Glaring at them with wide eyes, the man had to restrain himself from not walking up to them and reaching for their collars. Realizing he drew unwanted attention, he raised up a hand, and began to apologize. I'm sorry. What I meant to say was that you shouldn't get your hopes up, be grateful for the comrade you've gotten back. That brings up another question, Biska broached the issue, the gunslinger looking at him with a more critical eye. Who are you? I feel like I should know you, but I can't place why. Yeah, it is strange, Warren spoke, raising forefingers as he concentrated on his telepathy. I can't read his mind either. It's clouded. Who is he? I'm Wendy's friend, Doranbolt replied stoically, meeting his accusing stare with a cagey glare back. That's all you need to know. If you haven't noticed, this is Fairy Tale, not a public mead hall, Max spoke derisively, waving a hand out at him. We appreciate you being there for her, but can you please leave? As in, now. Wait, Wendy raised a hand, stopping any further altercation between everyone. I want him here. But Wendy, it's fine, Biska, Macau interjected, giving a knowing glance to Wakaba before smiling over at Doranbolt. Name's Macau Conbolt, and, in light of these events, I'm now the official fourth master of Fairy Tale. Though we aren't much, given circumstances, we still have heart and pride in ourselves as free-spirited mages. You are welcome to stay here as long as you like, until Wendy or I say otherwise. Does that sound fair, mister? Smiling at this, the striped-shirted scarred man nodded with appreciation. It's Doranbolt. And thank you for your understanding and hospitality. Despite a few looks of confusion and disbelief at the conclusion of his stay, Wendy was happy that Macau wasn't refusing. She felt kinship to the man, for having seen him beg her to be of use in any way for failing to do what he thought he could have. While her guild didn't know it now, Doranbolt had a pure heart beyond his ego and wants to put others ahead of himself. Maybe I can too, she thought to herself, quietly hugging the sleeping Charles as she considered this train of thought. Guild, after my mission's failure, isn't lost on me. I can only wonder how long I can keep it up. Well, the guild seems to think you're alright, Charles answered. That's good enough for me, for now. Yeah, Doranbolt muttered, drifting to sleep in his odd position as he closed with drifting thoughts. I wonder how the higher-ups will think of me hanging around here instead of reporting back. They're probably pretty mad. Drinks, enjoying the return of at least one of their members safe and sound, the celebrated survivor herself sat alone, with only Charles for company. Her mood, while it didn't infect the room, could be felt around her. The lavender-haired lackey checked in on Wendy from time to time, and the little dragon slayer smiled only to wave her off, before resuming her solitary sitting. It's been nearly a week since she's returned to us, but we all can tell. She puts on a brave face, but she's in a horrible amount of pain. Macau hesitated before continuing, as it was quite clear he didn't like the route this conversation took, despite being the one to broach it. Well, probably would be easier if she forgets it. Everything about that makes her cry, everything lackey and the others here during the night. Silence followed Masau's statement. Doranbolt's face was grim as he watched his small companion, and he could only close his eyes, sighing. It isn't like the thought never crossed my mind, he admitted. But, to use it that way, I couldn't bear it. I've done enough harm to Wendy, and repressing her memories on a scale like that would be far too sudden. The massive hole it would leave in her memory would be unexplainable. Also, my magic isn't foolproof. If something jogged her memory back into place, the shock could potentially render her mentally crippled. I'm sorry, but I refuse. Macau placed a hand on Doranbolt's shoulder, giving it a fatherly grip. I understand. Just keep what I said in mind, Doranbolt. Time heals all wounds, but the kind that are buried this deep may never truly heal. I know. Doranbolt left the conversation on this foreboding note, and crossed the room instantly through the use of direct line, materializing by Wendy's side. He leaned casually against the wooden table, his sudden appearance having startling a departing lackey, yet leaving Wendy unperturbed, though Charlie's fur stood on end. How are you doing? His voice, far from the stern tone he'd carried in his conversation with the fourth master, had become gentle and kind instantly when he spoke to Wendy. Nothing's changed, said Wendy, slowly. I'm finally home. But it's still so hard. Wherever Wendy looked in the guild, she couldn't shake the shades of her teammates and friends. Gajil on stage, Natsu and Gray fighting in the middle of the bar, somehow roping Elfman into their mess. Urza's exasperated efforts to rein them in, while poor Lucy could only watch and let the chaos sweep her along, and Makarov allowing the chaos. The bar itself seemed empty without Mira Jane to serve drinks. Kanna's usual perch was empty, and Juvia would have been fawning over Gray at this time. Levy should be where Jed and Droy sat, a duo who looked nearly as forlorn as Wendy herself. Their memories are everywhere. I know it hurts, Wendy. Charles reached up from the table to lay a paw on Wendy's shoulder. Please, don't rush yourself. Neither one of us expects you to bounce back immediately. She's right, replied Doranbolt. Healing is a slow process. When you're ready to take your first step, we'll be here to support you. Thanks, you too, Wendy. It's too soon. Charles objected, putting her foot down figuratively and literally, a small thunk, indicating her stomping for emphasis. I am firmly against you taking any kind of mission, S-rank or otherwise, in the state you're in. I know I'm not an S-class mage. And I know I'm not in the best place right now. Wendy placed both hands to her chest, gripping them tightly. No more tears, no more crying, but this is how I'll take my first step forward. If I just sit here, everyone's sacrifice in my life will be wasted, won't they? I've come home, to my family. And if a job like this is what we'll need to stay afloat, then I can't say no. Please, Master, let me do it. Materializing at her side, Doranbolt's hand gripped Wendy's shoulder. If Wendy is going, then I am going. Doranbolt. Wendy's face broke into a weakened smile. Surely you didn't think I would let you go alone. As if she'd be alone, replied Charles huffily. If I can truly do nothing to stop Wendy from going, then I shall be going as well. I don't think a party of 3 is really going to cut it, Max spoke up, sliding out of his chair and walking over towards the strange trio to stand beside them. I'm not really S-class material either, but you'll find my magic can be helpful in a pinch. Besides, he added, I'm not sure I completely trust you yet, Doranbolt. And fairy tale mages have to watch out for their own. To everyone's surprise, Macau began to cry. Tears poured from his eyes, his shoulders shook, and the man began to wail loud enough to attract the attention of onlookers passing by outside. "Everyone, even with the master and the others gone, we've still got a damn fine guild." Clearing his throat, Macau abruptly stood tall, crossing his arms firmly and adopting a sudden official attitude. "Very well, as the fourth master of the Fairy Tale Guild, I approve this S-rank mission." However, Macau waved his hand, thrusting it, palms flat, out towards Doranbolt. The cloth covering Doranbolt's right shoulder vanished, revealing a bare forearm. The skin darkened, and the pattern of the Fairy Tale Guild symbol emerged, bright and orange. Guild rules prohibit mages unaffiliated with the guild from taking on quests under our name. Doranbolt spluttered, gripping his shoulder in vivid shock. "Macau, what did you? Welcome to Fairy Tale, Doranbolt." The spirit of the guild was considerably higher as the strange new team of Max Allure, Doranbolt, Wendy Marvell, and Charles made their preparations for the sudden S-rank mission. Macau informed the royal capital that the mission had officially been accepted by their guild, and within a day, the quartet was ready to depart. Wendy found the suspense almost stifling as she and her teammates stood on the door of the Fairy Tale Guild, ready to step outside. Nervously, Wendy took a tentative step over the threshold, and for a moment, felt as though 19 familiar pairs of hands gently nudged her along, her feet stepping out into the roads of Acnologia and beyond. It was time to move forward. When the four had departed, the guild remained celebratory. All except Jet and Droy, who, if anything, would have been the exact opposite of the life of the party. "Do you think we should have volunteered too, Jet?" asked Droy, his voice listless. The idea that Levi had possibly survived, when Wendy had arrived, had reignited hope. When no news of any Fairy Tale members had surfaced over the past week, that fire died out as soon as it had ignited. They had to accept the reality. "Part of me wanted to," replied Jet. "But, without Levi, what is Team Shadow Gear?" Levi. The two of them, never usually seen out of the company of their third member, had taken the losses of those at Tenrō Island as hard as Wendy. "We only took on some of those higher-ranked jobs because of Levi," said Droy, to Jet's agreement. "We're going to have to re-examine Shadow Gear from the top down. If Wendy can move forward, so can we." The winds for Fairy Tale were finally shifting. "Have been a cinch with that teleportation magic of yours." "On my own, yes. But as I explained, it would be a handicap for you, including I, to rely on me for transportation. At least this way we can enter the city without raising a fuss as traffic into the capital is usually regulated pretty strictly," Doranbolt explained as neutrally as he could. "Still doesn't make me like the idea of taking 2 whole days to get here," Max grumbled, looking over his shoulder at the ritzy dressed musicians and singers still playing in the background. "I'm starting to miss the peace and quiet. We should be there soon," Doranbolt encouraged, looking down to Wendy with a smile. "Once we get there, we'll meet with the king and then decide where we should stay for the night before our next plan of action is invoked." "All right," Wendy nodded, hiding her fatigue with a brighter smile than she had any right showing from the past week of grieving she had done. The teleporter didn't remark, simply smiling in return as best as he could. Charles looked with concern at Wendy and Max furrowed his brows, wondering just exactly what they were in for. Upon landing the airship, the band gave their farewells to the team and they took a short hike down the designated landing zone near the base of the mountain to the nearest gate. Doranbolt gave the guards the letter that was sent to Fairy Tale, showed him his newly minted mark along with the rest of his party, and they were easily allowed entry into the city through the massive gates. It was even more gorgeous up close. Wendy's eyes sparkled and her open mouth turned into a genuine ear-to-ear smile. Just as quickly as the crowd saw and remarked on the existence of Fairy Tale mages, they'd instantly see them disappear out of thin air. Remarking on the event, they all looked around while guards armed with enchanted spears walked up and broke up the crowd. All the while, in the shadow of a proximate alley, stood a small girl of sprightly stature with orange frayed hair and a sleeveless jacket covering her lithe form. Placing fingerless gloved fingers up behind her head, she glanced at her shadow and gave a shrug, waltzing away, till she disappeared in the dark, as if she never existed to begin with. They approached a few more steps and then addressed her more formally. "Your Grace, it is great to make your acquaintance," Doranbolt spoke ahead of them, placing a hand over his chest as he announced to her. "Though I am not as tied to the guild as heavily as those beside me, I think I speak for all of us that I am grateful that you made the time for our audience. Please, it is I who am happy to see you came all this way even after your guild has experienced such hardships so recently," the princess spoke, her verdant hair moving luxuriously across her bare shoulders and neck as she shook her head with dismissal. Looking to Wendy, she gave her a nod of respect her way. I am pleased to hear at least one had survived the tragedy. I won't speak of it since the council has deemed it a classified matter, but I do hope the fate of your guild is unraveled and perhaps we can all move past it. Thank you. Wendy hesitated, though formed a weak smile as she bowed respectfully to the princess once again. Now, on to matters, the royal-blooded teenager spoke, her face becoming a more stoic and business-oriented mask to deal with their current transaction. I'm not sure you've been made aware, but the bounty on this job is very high for good reason. Have you come to any conclusions as why that is? Looking to one another, they began to ponder what had been lingering in the back of their heads. Is it because this isn't strictly a matter involving Fury? Charles inquired thoughtfully. That's correct, Hisui remarked with a chaste grin that vanished as quickly as it came. This gang, you see, is quite notorious for its effective ability of targeting various nations of their most prized possessions. Specifically, they are after the treasuries belonging to the monarchies, and have made no secret they have a special kind of prejudice to those of the ruling bodies of these various countries. Why do they have such a beef with royals, if you don't mind me asking? Max inquired, a furrowed brow. We have no idea, the princess confessed. While attempts have been made to impair their progress, nothing has come close to stopping them. They've stolen precious artifacts, jewels of countless worth and many forms of physical currency. We don't know where they're redistributing them or if they're keeping a hoard close at hand or far away. The only thing we know is that the less fortunate towns and cities based on the victimized leadership sudden get anonymous donations that give them a wave of temporary relief. Are they really that bad? Wendy inquired, almost wincing at the looks she got from the chief and the guards standing nearby. I mean, they're not doing a good thing, stealing from people. But they're giving it away to others. I don't understand how they can be solely terrible if they suffering. It must end here, in Fury, before they do any more damage to the rest of Ishgard. Standing up, the princess did something that made Arcadios, the guards and the mages all look on in shock as she bows to the four of them. I beg of you, as heir to the throne of Fury, please do all that is in your power as fairy tale to end this madness. A sense of tension rose from the pregnant silence that was only marginally helped by the sound of breathing, muttering and exchanges of glances with clinking of armor. Doranbolt felt at a complete loss for what would be the most appropriate reaction. His confusing relationship with the guild didn't help matters as he didn't do well with people and had a better time misleading others rather than convince them. Max was out of his depth, and beyond his bluster of confidence, he knew he wasn't up to the task that was being asked of him. Even Charles felt this was a mistake, and that perhaps they shouldn't have come this far to disappoint such a passionate youth, princess or not. But Wendy, beyond all of the turmoil still swirling inside of her, chose to take a step forward. We will stop them, Your Grace, Wendy spoke, her voice not shaking nor hollow, as her brown eyes met Hisui's surprised jewels for irises. And we'll give back the stolen treasures to the kingdoms they've wronged. That I promise you. Shut his eyes and sleep while Charles kept a watchful eye out, tossed in the cot. His sleep was far from restful, but actually having a proper place to lay his head, as opposed to sleeping on the floor at the foot of Wendy's bed, as he had taken to ensure she was free from night terrors, was easing his shut-eye. It was when the young man was beginning to fully drift off into sleep that his ears exploded under the force of a blood-curdling shriek. Doranbolt sat bolt upright, scanning the room instantly. Charlie's fur bristled, the sound of the shrieking ending the exceed over the edge. It dawned on the two of them immediately who the source of it was, Wendy, who was sitting up, clutching her soaked sheets, her body covered in a sheen of sweat. She was panting as if she'd just run a mile, tears stinging her eyes. Charles, Doranbolt, please tell me you're here. Her vision was muddled from the tears, and sight came difficulty to her. When Doranbolt and Charles had rushed to her side, Wendy's breathing began to pace even, and she calmed down. I'm sorry, it happened again, I saw it. Everyone gone, in a flash of light. Dot and I was alone. Wendy found she had to force the words out, as her voice caught in her throat when she tried to explain. Surprising both Doranbolt and Charles, Wendy grabbed hold of his shirt, clutching Doranbolt tightly as she began to cry afresh. Her tears stained his clothes, but Doranbolt did not rebuke her, nor did he try and shake her off. He simply let the girl cry, gingerly placing his hands on her shoulders, almost as if he feared the contact, yet he still wanted to comfort the girl, refusing to push her away. "Do you have nightmares too?" Wendy hiccuped into his shirt, her voice muffled only slightly. "Do you have nightmares too?" The question stuck Doranbolt like a physical blow. And he knew the answer. "Yes," he replied quietly. Every night, his own guilt-rattled mind tormented him whenever he sought the solitude of sleep. The sight of Acnologia, rushing across the sky, the faces of all the people he could have saved, he, a member of the Magic Council who had let the innocent and guilty alike be purged by fate, and the sight of a brilliant white light on the horizon. This shocked Wendy enough that she pulled away from his torso, reddened eyes widening as they met Doranbolt's narrower ones. The young dragon slayer hadn't been so ignorant to believe that Doranbolt wasn't carrying his own baggage, but he always seemed so strong and self-assured. He was the rock she was relying on, and to hear that he too had his own nightmares of the incident shocked her. But also made her feel a closer kinship with Doranbolt than ever before. "You do, really? How do you deal with them?" Doranbolt shook his head. "We're still not so far removed from the tragedy that I can say I have. Truth be told, I might never get over them. But I just deal with them when they come, that's all." "Oh." The disappointment in Wendy's voice was clear, striking through Doranbolt's heart. Wendy had been searching for an answer. She wasn't to be rid of this pain. Gripping her shoulders, perhaps more tightly than initially intended, Doranbolt kept his eyes locked to Wendy's. "But you're not me, Wendy. You'll get over this in time. Being so young helps give you the benefit of learning how to cope as you mature." He chose his words carefully, deliberately, putting meaning behind each of them. He could not let Wendy suffer like this. And with such good friends still in the guild, I'm sure your family will help look out for you. Thanks, Doranbolt." Wendy rubbed her eyes, letting the remainder of the tears smear the back of her hand. "It helps. Talking to someone about all this. It really does." "Don't mention it," replied Doranbolt. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately, and the trio were frozen by the sudden tremor, unable to think coherently. The ground felt as if it was moving, the castle walls shaking, and a noise comparable to thunder rang out throughout the walls of the building. For a moment, the idea that an earthquake was the source of the tremors passed through everyone's minds, and only when the sounds became discernible as explosions did the truth come to light. Doranbolt realized it first. "We need to get Max. The castle is under attack." Entirety of the castle and its ground, yet it only touched the minds of those close to her heart. All motion within the castle slowed. Her allies, many of who were still unveiled, faltered only slightly. They were used to her telepathy, but every now and again, it still gave them pause. "We have our orders, loves. Please avoid any unnecessary violence. All for the sake of our blue bird." A mix of emotions flooded her mind. Irritation, understanding, amusement. A smile played on her lips. They truly were like children. "The preemptive assault is being carried out in Section A-1. Our forward units may proceed into the interior of Mercurius. The treasury is located deep in Section D3. The staff is asleep. We are to avoid unnecessary casualties. Only take the lives of the guards who stand in our way." The mental connection was terminated, and the woman heaved a sigh. The children were always so rowdy, and she wasn't quite sure it was fair to let her shoulder the responsibility of raising them. That responsibility should not fall to someone of my role, should it, my blue bird? No, that should fall to you and your lieutenant. Her crimson eyes glanced towards the section of Mercurius Castle she knew the treasury to lay. Sending in a small, light squad was always ideal for a proper theft, but she felt that her presence may be needed. There was a presence within Mercurius Castle. She had felt it when her awareness had been extended throughout the castle, searching for her allies. A presence only too similar to one she knew well. The elf frowned. This may not be a simple theft after all. Mercurius Interior, Treasury Chamber. Arcadios, a statuesque man even under normal circumstances, was now regaled in armor that sharply contrasted his dreary gray standard ordnance. The white lily armor was now adorned over his sharply shaped facial features and broad muscular body. Armor platemail with a gleaming silver hue with petal-adorned pauldrons, matching the petals of metal that formed his greaves, and a helmet that covered all but his lower face in the immaculate pale-colored metal in the shape of a bird of prey. A head of feathers in bright yellow flourished with a proud mane, a jade cloak wrapped around his neck to flow down in a tapestry of beautiful material like silk as it rivulet around in the air rushing past him. All of this highlighting features that overshadowed the deep forest green undersuit that was worn beneath the heavy plate mail. With his hands, one on top of the other, resting on golden-hilted broadsword with a verdant jewel resting within the pommel, the edge of the double sides placed in between the tiles that led straight to the vault rearing up behind him. Standing astride Arcadios were 5 men, armored similarly, his division of knights, the Cherry Blossom Holy Knights Squadron. The vault itself, home to the vast wealth of Fiore's crown royalty, was an immense arching pair of doors. Standing behind the squadron, the trim was that of steel with accented emerald metal akin to vines with blossoming flowers that wrapped itself from the bottom of the seam to rest over top. Within the base was a massive dial, with a key slot resting in its center, each handle being as long as the sword of the man standing in front of it, and thicker than any pike a guard would carry. It truly beheld a glamour and sturdiness one would expect of a gateway leading to the greatest of treasure troves. Not a single soul will make it past this spot. On the honor of His and Her Highness, I swear it, thought Arcadios, determined. A sizzling, firecracker-like sound could be heard from the distance, alerting Arcadios and his knights to suspicious activity incoming. The hallway that loomed out before them was shrouded in darkness, but this darkness was not being pierced by a brilliant orange glow. It cast off an eerie light, illuminating a humanoid figure. As she breached the hallway and into the spacious room that contained the treasury, it was revealed that it was a beautiful, but tiny girl. She had blonde hair, cut short at her neck, wearing what could only be described as an adventurer's outfit, a brown vest, worn over a thin strip of elastic cloth that covered a non-existent bust, with black shorts, hanging loosely and only held up by a thick belt. Around her neck, she donned a crimson cape, and as she moved, her hips swayed. And yet the most noteworthy thing about the young woman wasn't her diminutive build, or her strange attire. It was the fact that her hands were cloaked in flames. "We've only got 5 of 'em," grumbled the tiny woman. "Hey Brutalia, you might be disappointed. We ain't got much of 'em here, just a runty bunch of soldiers and a peacock with a sword. Don't you have any finesse, runt?" A voice, as crisp and beautiful as a bell chime, yet frigid and cold as a winter gust. The irony of you, with someone so lacking in womanly charms, calling others, runt, is quite delicious. The woman came into view, her visage and body aglow, and it revealed the form of a beautiful woman who was practically royalty by looks alone. She was draped in a gown of crimson and ebony, ornately decorated with jewels and roses. It was cut low at the chest, revealing a plump bosom that quivered with each step. Her hair, a deep honey blonde, was worn long, adorned by a wreath of flowers as black as night. Within her hands, she clasped a handheld fan directly over her face. "Hello, boys, we're going to breaking through now." Arcadios gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, his face firm and set. "Not on my life, woman. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Lee Fist for finding this great fanfic. The next part will be out soon.